In 1981, a Chinese ornithologist named Liu Yinzhen climbed into the Qinling Mountains of Shaanxi province, expecting to confirm what the scientific community had already decided. The crested ibis was extinct. He had been sent to record that absence and close the file on a species that had disappeared from China, Korea, Japan, and Russia over the previous 2 decades. What he found instead in a single tree in a single mountain village changed the path of one of the most ambitious wildlife recoveries in Asian history. And what those 7 birds did to the mountains around them in the 40 years that followed was something no one in that village in 1981 could have imagined. Liu had spent 3 years preparing for this ending. He and his colleagues at the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences had traveled more than 50,000 kilometers across 14 provinces looking for proof that the crested ibis still existed. Every lead had gone cold. Every report had turned out to be a wrong identification or an old sighting. By the spring of 1981, Liu had written the paper. Its title was clear and final. The crested ibis was extinct in China. Before sending it in, he asked for one more field visit to Yangshan County, to the southern slopes of the Qinling Range, where a local forestry worker named Liu Baozhang had told him, without much confidence, that something matching the description had been seen near a village called Yaojiagu. Liu did not believe it. He went anyway. On May 23, 1981, in a stand of trees above terraced rice fields, Liu Yinzhen found 7 crested ibises, 2 breeding pairs and 3 fledglings, the last of the species anywhere on Earth, not just in China, but anywhere. He stood below the nesting tree and felt, by his own account, not relief, but fear. 7 birds carrying the entire genetic future of a species that had once ranged from Siberia to the South China Sea, in a single tree above a farming village that had no idea what was living in it. 4 days later, the Yangjian County government issued emergency protection orders. No hunting in the birds' living areas, no cutting of nesting trees, no use of chemical fertilizers or pesticides in the foraging zones, no explosives or firearms in the breeding areas. 4 people were placed at the nesting site around the clock, watching the birds by day and guarding them from predators by night. The team spread butter on the trunks of the nesting trees to stop snakes from climbing. They kept records of every behavior, every feeding, and every movement of every bird. What happened next in the Qinling Mountains took 40 years to fully understand. The crested ibis is a foraging bird. It walks through shallow water, flooded rice paddies, slow streams, and muddy field edges, pushing its long curved beak into the mud for loaches, frogs, freshwater crabs, and invertebrates. For the birds to survive in Yaojiagu, those feeding areas had to produce food. That meant the rice paddies around the nesting site had to stay the way they were, traditionally farmed without the chemical inputs that modern agricultural intensification had introduced across the rest of China's countryside. The pesticides and synthetic fertilizers that had become normal practice across rural Shaanxi killed the invertebrates the birds fed on. Where they were used, the paddy fields became food deserts. Where they were banned, the fields stayed alive. The farmers of Yangshan County understood this before the scientists had fully mapped it. The local government's protection orders had banned chemical inputs in the birds' foraging zones from 1981 onward. Farmers who had begun moving to modern agricultural methods were asked to return to traditional cultivation, organic compost, manual pest control, and no herbicides on the paddy edges. In economic terms, it was a step backward: lower yields, more labor, and no access to the inputs that were raising productivity everywhere else in China's rapidly modernizing farm sector. The farmers did it anyway. And what happened to the rice they grew is the part of the crested ibis story that the population numbers alone cannot explain. By the early 2000s, as the crested ibis population in Yangjian had grown from 7 to several hundred, the county government recognized something that had been building quietly for 2 decades. The rice, grown without pesticides in the ibis foraging zones, was different from the rice grown everywhere else. Cleaner water in the paddies produced cleaner grain. The lack of chemical residues made the rice measurably purer than conventionally farmed alternatives. Consumers in China's growing urban markets were willing to pay more for food they could trust. Yangshan County began marketing its rice under a certification that linked it directly to the Crested Ibis Protection Program. Ibis-friendly rice became a brand. A bird that had been found on the edge of extinction was becoming the branding foundation of an agricultural economy. By 2021, Yangjian's ibis-certified organic products covered more than 32,000 hectares of farmland and generated billions of yuan in annual revenue. The farmers who had been asked to farm without pesticides in 1981 were now farming without pesticides because it was more profitable than any other choice. The restriction that had first looked like an economic sacrifice had become, over 40 years, an economic advantage. The bird had not just survived in the agricultural landscape around it, it had changed that landscape's relationship with the market. But the change moving through the mountains was not only agricultural, it was ecological, and it reached far beyond the rice paddies. When the Yangjian government sealed the mountains around the nesting sites in 1981, banning logging and limiting human activity across the bird's habitat, the forests on those slopes were already badly damaged. Decades of firewood collection, agricultural expansion, and commercial logging had pushed the tree cover back from the valley floors. The streams that the crested ibis depended on for feeding were degraded, filled with silt, disturbed and stripped of the edge plants that support the invertebrate communities that wading birds feed on. Protecting the birds required protecting the habitat. Protecting the habitat meant letting the mountains recover. The forest grew back, not quickly, forests never do, but measurably, decade by decade. As the restrictions stayed in place and the pressure on the slopes eased, the streams regained their edge vegetation. The invertebrate communities that the ibises fed on returned to paddy edges and stream banks that had been damaged for years. The habitat area that could support crested ibises expanded from less than 5 square kilometers in 1981 to more than 16,000 square kilometers by 2022, an increase of more than 3,000 times. Not because anyone planted that habitat, but because the protection that saved the bird also gave the mountains the space they needed to rebuild themselves. Zhang Junfeng, a scientist at the Shaanxi Provincial Rare Wildlife Rescue Base at the northern foot of the Qinling Mountains, began working with the captive breeding program in 2002 when 60 birds were moved to the facility from Yangjian. Her task, as she described it, was simple and enormous at the same time: let the birds reproduce as fast as possible to ensure the species' survival. The captive breeding program used reproductive technologies developed through years of trial and repeated failure, and it used artificial incubation, hand-rearing protocols, and disease prevention measures that had not existed when Lu found the 7 birds in 1981. By the time Zhang's team had fully refined the program, the Shaanxi base was producing hundreds of birds each year. The facility raised more than 500 birds, and it released more than 140 into the wild. 6 artificial breeding bases were established across the country, using animals supplied from Shaanxi. The knowledge developed at the rescue base became the technical foundation for every later crested ibis reintroduction in China, in Japan, and eventually in South Korea, where the species had been extinct since the 1970s. The numbers that returned from the wild followed the captive program's output with a delay that reflected the slow biological clock of a species that matures at 3 years and raises at most 1 clutch per season. 7 birds in 1981 hundreds by the late 1990s, more than 1,800 by 2013, more than 9,000 by 2022, more than 10,000 by 2024, with 7,700 of them in Shaanxi province alone. The habitat that had shrunk to a single valley in the Qinling Mountains now stretched across the province and beyond. Reintroduced populations had been established in Jiangxi, Henan, and other provinces. China had exported birds to Japan and South Korea, providing the genetic foundation for reintroduction programs in countries where the species had been gone for decades. Lu Yinzhen, the ornithologist who had spent 3 years walking 50,000 kilometers across China to confirm that the crested ibis no longer existed, lived to see the population pass 10,000. He had finished his extinction paper, and then, before filing it, asked for one more field visit. That decision, made not from scientific certainty, but from something closer to a reluctance to close a door, led to the discovery that changed everything. He described the moment of finding the birds in the nesting tree above Yaojiagu not as triumph, but as the beginning of a different kind of fear. 7 animals, the whole world's supply of a species that had flown above East Asia for 60 million years. Whether they could survive depended on decisions made in the days, months, and years that followed by people who had never planned to be conservation managers, farmers, local officials, forestry workers, and a team of scientists who drove to a village in Yangxian County on a hunch. There is a rice paddy in Yangxian County, Shaanxi Province, where crested ibises forage in the morning mist above traditional fields farmed without pesticides since 1981. The farmers who work those fields earn more for their rice than conventionally farmed neighbors because the lack of chemicals forced on them 40 years ago has become, in a market that values clean food, a competitive advantage. The mountains above the paddy have more forest cover than they did in 1981. The streams that feed the paddy have more invertebrates in them than they did when Lu Yinzhen climbed past them toward the nesting tree. 7 birds in a single tree above a village that did not know what they were. What the mountains look like today is what 40 years of decisions made around that tree created. That is not a fairy tale. That is what 10,000 crested ibises and 40 years of documented conservation science look like across 16,000 square kilometers of northwest China. And it is what a single ornithologist's reluctance to file his extinction paper made possible. But China is not the only country where the discovery of a species on the absolute edge of extinction set in motion a transformation that reached far beyond the animal itself. In our next video, we travel to Japan, where the same birds, exported as a diplomatic gift between 2 governments, landed on a small island in the Sea of Japan and triggered an agricultural revolution that nobody in the reintroduction program had planned for. If you thought 7 ibises rebuilding the mountains of northwest China was unexpected, wait until you see what the same species did to the rice economy of Sado Island. You will not look at conservation the same way again.